Can everybody hear me okay? The sound coming through? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. Just want to make sure. So good morning, everybody. My name is Apryl, it's A. We will do more introductions as Pearl mentioned, but we wanted to start out with this land acknowledgement at Native Governance Center. We are an organization led by and for Native people. Therefore, it is important for us to protect the history and recognize the caretakers of the land we are on. So our office is located on the homelands of the Dakota people, which today is known as St. Paul, Minnesota. And we recognize that the Dakota people have lived here for thousands of years and continue to live here and thrive today. And we also want to give recognition and acknowledgement to the many Anishinaabe people who also reside within the Twin Cities as well. We know that there's been a lot that's been happening the last couple of months since the murder of George Floyd and the civil unrest. And so we wanted to make sure to also give recognition and to share that at Native Governance Center, we stand strongly in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. Initially, this gathering was actually scheduled back in June, right after the murder of George Floyd, and we thought it would be best to postpone and give space for grieving and healing, and also to honor the life of George and all the other Black lives lost due to injustice. And now just recently, the shooting of Jacob Blake in Wisconsin. We wish him a really positive recovery and hope that justice will be served. And as Indigenous peoples, we know all too well the injustices that exist in the United States because our people have unfortunately experienced them firsthand. Therefore, we feel it's important to support each other's communities as we imagine and rebuild a better future for our people. So we just wanted to acknowledge and start our presentation off with that and to give recognition in a good way. And I'll go ahead and pass this back over to Pearl to do an opening for us.
Great, April. We like to, at our organization, do sort of grounding when we work with partners and our stakeholders so that we come to this space together in a good way. So I'm going to share a song as I was thinking about today and this presentation and what we're sharing and what else is going on in the world. The water song came to me, and there's multiple water songs. But this particular one I'm going to share with you is one I learned from Doreen Day, who is one of our mentors here in the Twin Cities. And she came up with this song with her grandson because they wanted to honor the water, which we know all connects all of us as women, as Indigenous people across nations, and our water is very sacred to us. So it's also healing when we pray with it. So if you have some water or tea with you, I encourage you to have that near you while we listen to the. I share this song with you. So we're going to go cog and don't give up. Maybe guess I gave Nimi great away, nimi go. Yes, away, nimi go. Maybe guess I gave Nimi great away, nimi go. Yes, away, nimi go. Maybe yes, I Miigwech. I'm going to pass it back to April.
Pearl, that was really, really beautiful. It's amazing how our language and our songs can be so grounding and so, you know, such good medicine. So for that. We wanted to start to open up a little bit more about like Native Governance Center and who we are and what we do. Native Governance Center is a Native-led nonprofit organization, and our mission is to assist tribal nations in strengthening their governance systems and capacity to exercise sovereignty through leadership development and tribal governance support. And our current region consists of working and supporting the 23 Native nations that and South Dakota. We recognize that as Native nations, we had and still do have, you know, structures of governance. We had really strong structure of governance and systems and communities in place prior to colonization. And so we work with tribal nations to help rebuild their governments in a way that best supports their tribal citizens, as well as aligns well with their culture and history. And so that's a little bit about Native Governance Center. We'll do a little more in-depth introductions. This is Pearl and I. Pearl and I have both been working with Native Governance Center for almost 2 years. We're actually getting ready to celebrate our 2-year work anniversary. We started the same day. We have a lot of different things in common, and so we joke around and say that we're cosmic twins. For those Diné relatives on the call, I'll introduce myself. Yat a she'e a shihin ishlent tatchini bashichin tabehe dashache kitlachini dashanale she'e Apryl Deel-McKenzie yinishya. I'm Diné. I'm from the Navajo Nation. Currently residing here in St. Paul on the Dakota homelands. And been with NGC for 2 years, almost 2 years, as I mentioned. I'm one of the program managers. I oversee our tribal governance support services. My background, I've worked with different nonprofit organizations, many of them Native-led organizations, focused on community type of work, education, mentorship work. I also worked for my tribal college at Diné College in Saley, Arizona for several years in student services. And then eventually I moved on to pursue my master's degree in social work. And after completing that degree, moved here to Minnesota, where my husband started a master's degree program. And so that's what brought me out to this area, but have hopes to return back to my homeland and my people soon. So that's a little bit about me. Turn it over to you, Pearl.
Miigwech, April. Ihani Washte, in the Wayne Magama, Spanskawing, Indigenous Cause, Negazi, and Dodim, Wana King and Debandago, Skowabikaniko, Kaginton Jaba, the Miigwech, Windom, Ma, Alliance. So, good morning, everyone. My relatives, my name is Pearl. I have a Lakota name because I am originally from Standing Rock. And I speak mostly Ojibwe because my mother's Ojibwe, and that's where I spent a lot of my time. And childhood and early adulthood is in the Ojibwe country of Minnesota, Makoche area, and I'm happy to be here today. Same as April, we had the same start date at Native Governance Center. I'm the program manager for our Rebuilders program, which is our grassroots initiative of leadership development for nation building or Native nation rebuilding. And we'll talk a little bit about that framework here too, of what that is. And it's a mindset shift, and teaching members from tribal nations within our region that April mentioned to uplift their communities through mindset shift of nation building and what that means for governance. So I'm actually an alumni of the Rebuilders program. I was in cohort 7, Sacred 7, and now that's my role, is to support and oversee that program. My background is similar to April's. I worked in some higher education with tribal colleges in North Dakota before coming here. My educational background is in public health. I got a master's in public health with a concentration in health management and policy. And I'm also a doula and a certified lactation counselor. So that's kind of a growing passion of mine, is that sort of birth work in the birth space, and how we teach and give love to each other. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm going to pass it back to April.
All right, thank you, Pearl. As Pearl mentioned a little bit about Native Nation rebuilding work, we wanted to start off with just giving a little bit of foundation about what Native Nation rebuilding is. So research was conducted by Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development over many years, and one of the things that they were looking into was trying to better understand how certain tribal nations were more effective than others, particularly looking at their economic development and trying to understand, you know, like there's a vast diversity between tribal nations, and some, you know, their operations and their governance structures and their economic development was a little stronger than others. And so they did this project to really try to understand what is it that makes those tribal governments more effective. And one of the things that they found out was, in looking at multiple case studies of various tribal nations, they found that those that were more effective had these 5 Native Nation rebuilding principles exemplified in the work that they were doing. And so this is a Native Nation rebuilding like philosophy. Sometimes it's Native Nation building, sometimes it's rebuilding. I personally lean towards rebuilding because I like to recognize and give honor to the fact that as Native peoples, we had strong governments in place prior to contact. And so we wanted to just share a few of these principles with you all, and this helps frame like how we came up with our Indigenous Communications article that we published. And so the rebuilding principles are spirited leadership, so individuals who recognize the need for fundamental change and can engage with the community to make that change happen. We realize that it's really important to have strong leaders at the forefront in terms of making positive change within our nations. And so that is a big reason why we do the Rebuilders program, is to strengthen that and support that. Another principle is the capable governing institution. So you're backing up your governance with responsibilities and with competence, and having good, strong structures and operations in place. The other principle is strategic orientation. So decisions are made with long-term priorities in mind. And as Indigenous peoples, you know, we think this way already. You know, we think about 7 generations and what are the decisions we're making today that are going to impact those, you know, 7 generations from now. So thinking about that in a good way, and being able to make those good decisions so that they are effective long-term. Another principle is cultural match. Institutions build and innovate upon Indigenous conceptions of governing responsibilities. Our cultural practices and values are so important, and you know, we should be integrating them in as much of the work as we do and in our lives. And so that's a huge part of what we'll be talking about in this communications piece. And of course, tribal sovereignty, that the nations get to stand up and, you know, do what they need to do to protect their people. And that will be highlighted here as we go through the different components of indigenizing communications. So when we had the discussion about developing this article on indigenized communications during COVID, Pearl and I, and our with our director, program director, and our communications person, we all got together and collaborated and had a brainstorm around this topic. And we wanted to put out some materials that would really help support our nations and our peoples during this time. And we took those principles that I just talked about and kind of broke them down a little bit more into these 5 Indigenous values. We know that there's many Indigenous values, and so, you know, this is just a few of them that we wanted to highlight as we developed some strategies and approaches for Indigenized communication. So Pearl and I will be going through each of these 5 values, and we'll also highlight a few examples that we've seen since the pandemic started here in the U.S. and in Indian country. So the first one here is self-determination. You know, there's a lot of different ways that people define self-determination, and sometimes it can get a little muddy about how to best talk about it. And so the way we looked at it is that self-determination is the ability to identify, define, and implement solutions that are appropriate for your people. And so the biggest thing that we want to highlight here is that you all, as either Indigenous leaders and staff members of your organizations or leaders of tribal nations, that exercising your sovereignty and practicing self-determination is so important during this time. You all are the experts of knowing what your community needs, what your people need. You have the solutions of how to best protect the health and safety of your tribal citizens. And so looking at your communications, you want to think about ways like, how is self-determination showing up in this? How can I approach it in this way? You know, and looking at ways to mobilize and like empower your people to not only, you know, protect their people and their loved ones and their neighbors, but also for them to pass on the message that you're all standing together in solidarity to protect the safety of your people. And so in looking at self-determination, there have been a lot of different examples that have come about. And one of the ones we wanted to highlight here is of a tribal nation within our region. You all are probably aware of what has been happening in South Dakota. Many of the tribal nations there have been doing a lot to protect their people during the time of COVID. And one of the things they've been doing is setting up borders, setting up checkpoints, you know, making sure to like figure out who's coming in and out of their tribal lands, and being able to say yes or no to people passing through or not is a way that they are practicing self-determination and also exercising their tribal sovereignty to protect their people. And so this example here is a statement from Chairman Harold Fraser from Cheyenne River Sioux tribe. And just an example of showing how, you know, they're exercising their sovereignty, and that they're, you know, they made sure to quote the treaty and quote the different examples, and to justify what they are doing right now to protect their people in a good way. And so we wanted to highlight this piece. And we also know that other nations in South Dakota, like Rosebud Sioux tribe, as well as Oglala Lakota Nation, have all been doing similar things and putting out communications and statements that explain what they're doing and why they're doing it, and also why it's justified they're doing this to protect their people. The other value we have here is Indigenized Thinking. And I want to preface this a little bit with the fact that, you know, I know that all of us are in different places in terms of either learning or reconnecting or knowing our Indigenous values and practices and languages, but that we have that like ancestral wisdom in us to reconnect to that. And so at Native Governance Center, we really try to think about things like, how can we indigenize this? You know, if we learn some type of Western model or framework, you know, we constantly ask, okay, this is great, like, how can we use this? And then how can we also indigenize this? So in thinking about your communications, you know, you want to think similarly, like, how can you apply an Indigenous lens to what you are doing and what kind of messaging you're putting out? So some ways that you can do that is incorporating Native language into your communication materials, whether that's through, you know, written or oral or however, you know, putting it out in that way. And also recognize that the way your communication is being displayed it's probably going to look different than the way like your local, state, or federal government is putting things out, or the CDC is putting things out right now, information out in regards to precautions to COVID. And that's okay, you know, like you want to customize your messages in a way that reflects like your community's values, history, and their culture. And also think about, you know, kinship and like being a good relative. You know, that's a big, significant part of like looking at things through an Indigenous lens, and how you can use like some of these traditional stories and ways to integrate into the materials you put out in regards to protecting, you know, your organizations and staff and citizens, tribal citizens. So I'll go ahead and pass it back to you, Pearl. Oh, the example. I did this the other day. So the example for Indigenized thinking we wanted to highlight here is a piece here that Illuminative has done. They have a Warrior Up campaign, and they have a lot of cool materials on their website that you can download and print and hang up. But we like this one, Easy Steps to Be a Warrior, and how to wash your hands and use hand sanitizer. You know, it's both humorous, you know, and as natives, we love humor. Humor is good medicine, but it's also very informative. And then there have been a lot of other pieces. I know we have some Johns Hopkins people on this call, and we've loved some of the materials that your group has put out in terms of like ways to understand like social distancing and what does 6 feet apart really look like, and how do we tailor that to our people, and, you know, helping them understand these precautions in a good way. So.
And sustainability, that is thinking about the 7th generation in our future. So the 7th generation is not just 7 generations from now, it's into the future from where we're at right in this place and time together. And so that's very Indigenous to think beyond your generation. And think beyond the youth, and think for their youth. So, you know, thinking about how does my messaging include this future, these future generations? Does it include the youth? How am I incorporating this Indigenous thought into our messaging? And also thinking about being realistic with those statements. You know, it's great to dream and great to dream up things, but also to be real and be practical about how you're doing that. And so an example we found on this is from Redco, and they're based out of Rosebud, the Rosebud Sioux tribe. And this is on their Instagram account, if you follow them. And COVID-19 provides an opportunity to create a better world for future generations. That is the message they put. And then, you know, on Instagram, you can have more of a description on how they're doing that. So for them, it includes their focusing on the crisis of COVID. They are wanting to change how they're working through this so that they come out of COVID better than when they went into COVID as a people. And so thinking of the 7 generations within that is how they piece this together, and knowing that the work that they do now is very important and critical to future generations. So it's very Indigenous to think sustainably, and how that can look is like this example. If you follow them, check out their Instagram. They have some really great work that they're doing. I think now, since we have been in COVID for a few months, we really recognize how important it is to take care of ourselves so that we can take care of each other. And also that applies to leadership. It applies to other areas of life. And it's very Indigenous self-care is that we know we take care of ourselves so that we can still be with the people. And it's not just about your individual self, as you know we hear often in Western contexts of wellness and self-care. It's inclusive of your community. And so with that, does your messaging also include all forms of wellness that we prioritize as Indigenous people? spiritual health and wellness, mental health and wellness, physical health and wellness, emotional health and wellness. You know, how are those being incorporated into how you're speaking about, you know, what the topics that are of priority. So we follow this organization and the work that they do. And the example we found within wellness is Indian Collective. They wrote this article on spiritual fortitude, that right now is a time for spiritual fortitude. And so at the forefront, it includes that spiritual wellness aspect of health. And you can read the article more for what that means and how that plays out within this challenging time that we're in. So within wellness, you know, it's thinking about those four kind of main components of Indigenous health and wellness, and not just for self, but for community. And I'll turn it back to you, Apryl. Wait, I have the next one. Oh my gosh. Okay, our final kind of, our final one is on engagement. And engagement includes how are we welcoming all community members and accessing the information we're putting out. Does it include radio? Does it include print, newspaper? You know, and some of our community members may not use social media platforms regularly. So, you know, what are those other mediums that we can use to share out that information? And we also want to use language that's welcoming, so that they feel good about joining in on the conversation or being a part of the work that you're doing. And something we came across with engagement is using positive imagery or videos or other forms of art from Native artists when possible is really powerful to get people engaged in your messaging and engaged in what you're doing. So an example, we found a couple of examples. Maybe you've heard of ICO, the American Indian Community Housing Organization, who have, they have a lot of different art pieces they've pulled together around COVID, specific to COVID, and imagery that is culturally grounded information, but also kind of bridging in that recommendations regarding COVID. And so piecing together or pulling together Native artists that can speak to the work or the messaging that you're working on is just a great way to do that engagement piece. Another example we found is the video here. I don't think we put the link to show it, but it's in our resources list of Lower Sioux Indian community put together a video at the start of this, and really wanting to kind of write home to their community members and across the state that they are working together because we're all in this together, no matter what nation we're from. And so I'll wrap it up because that's my son. Okay. Oh.
Thank you, Pearl. Thank you so much for sharing that. We thought that we would take some time now to just have some discussion with you all, spend a few minutes. We have a couple of discussion questions that we would love to hear from you all a little bit about, and then we also will close out with just sharing some of the resources and just a reflective thought.